Silas Thorne was sitting in a bar, not in a chair precisely, more on a stool that wobbled with every breath he took, a treacherous piece of wood that threatened to spill him onto the sticky floor. He nursed a cup of the cheapest ale, a bitter, watery thing that did little to warm the perpetual chill in his bones. The chill of poverty. It was a dampness that seeped into everything, like mold in the walls of his shack. He knew the rules of this town, this forgotten smudge of a place called Greywater Crossing. Rule 1. Keep your head down. Don't draw the eye of anyone important, especially not Lord Critch, the man who owned the town, the debt, and the soul of every person in it. Rule 2. Pay your dues on time. An impossible task, but the effort was what mattered. It kept you in the game, even if the game was rigged. And especially Rule 3, the most important one. The one carved into the lintel of the town charter and the hearts of its people. Never, ever trust an orc. They were monsters. The boogeymen from the broken peaks. Instruments of the ancient wars that had left scars on the land and on men like him. But when he stumbled home through the whispering gloom of the direwood, he found her. An orc. She was collapsed in a tangle of roots at the base of an old oak, a desperate, broken thing. She was bleeding from a crude iron trap clamped tight around her calf, her green skin pale and clammy in the moonlight. Curled in the protective crook of her arm was a small child, shivering with a fever that was plain to see even from a distance. Silas saw the glint of tusks, the powerful shoulders of a warrior, the symbols of everything he was taught to fear. He saw a monster. But closer, he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the fierce, protective love for her child. He saw a mother, and in that moment, standing in the cold, wet woods with his empty stomach growling and the weight of his own desperate life pressing down on him, Silas Thorne broke the most important rule of all. That choice changed everything. He didn't think. Not really. Thought was a luxury, a slow, careful process for men with full bellies and warm beds. For Silas, there was only instinct, and his instinct, honed by years of seeing suffering he couldn't stop, screamed at him. It was the same instinct that made him share his rations with a dying enemy soldier on a forgotten battlefield, an act that had earned him a scar on his cheek and the scorn of his commander. It was a fatal strength, this inability to ignore suffering. He approached slowly, his hands held out, palms open, a gesture of peace. The orc female's head snapped up. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a sound like stones grinding together. Her eyes, the color of amber in the dim light, narrowed. She shifted, trying to put her body more fully between him and her child. Pain flared across her face as the trap's teeth bit deeper into her leg. "Easy," Silas whispered, his voice raspy. "I'm not going to hurt you." She spat a word at him in a guttural language he didn't understand. It sounded like a curse. It probably was. He didn't blame her. To her, he was the monster. A human. Small, weak, but part of the species that set these cruel traps in the woods. "Your child," Silas said, pointing with his chin. "He's sick." Her eyes flickered to the boy, and for a second, the warrior's mask crumbled. Fear. Pure, undiluted fear. It was a language they both understood perfectly. The boy coughed, a dry, rattling sound that echoed in the quiet woods. It was the sound of lungs filling with fluid. Silas knew that sound all too well. "I can help," he said. He took another step. The growl returned, louder this time. "I have a home. It's not much, but it's dry. There's a fire." She watched him, her gaze sharp, analytical. She was judging him, weighing the risk of trusting him against the certainty of her child dying in the cold. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the boy's ragged breathing and the drip of water from the leaves overhead. Silas sighed. He couldn't force her. He reached into the small pouch at his belt. His fingers brushed past the one thing of value he owned, a small, rusty iron key to a house and a life he'd lost a lifetime ago. He ignored it and pulled out the contents of his foraging trip, a handful of bitter roots and 3 pale, worm-eaten mushrooms. Not much. It was his dinner for the next 2 days. He placed the meager offering on the ground between them. "It's all I have." He backed away, giving her space. He turned as if to leave, to head back to his shack and leave them to their fate. He took 3 steps. His heart hammered against his ribs. He was a fool. A poor, starving fool giving away his last meal. A soft grunt stopped him. He turned back. The orc was staring at the roots, then at him. She looked at her son, whose shivering had intensified. With a groan of pain and effort, she reached for the crude lever on the trap. Her powerful fingers strained, the muscles in her arm cording, but her strength was sapped by hunger and blood loss. It wouldn't budge. Silas moved without a second thought. He knelt beside her, ignoring the way she flinched, the way her hand instinctively went to a knife she no longer had. "Let me," he said, his voice gentle. He put his hands on the cold iron. The mechanism was old and rusted. He had to put his entire wiry weight into it. Metal shrieked in protest. With a final shuddering groan, the teeth of the trap sprang open. Blood, dark and thick, welled from the ragged wound. The orc hissed in pain but didn't cry out. She tested her weight on the leg and nearly collapsed. "My home," Silas said again, more firmly this time. "It's close. Your boy needs warmth, now." She looked at him, a long, searching look. Her amber eyes held a universe of pain, distrust, and desperation. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, she acquiesced. She had made her choice too. Getting them back was an ordeal. The orc, she had not offered a name, and he dared not ask, leaned heavily on his shoulder. She was a mountain of muscle and bone, and Silas, thin and weary, staggered under her weight. She tried to carry her son, but her injured leg buckled, so Silas carried the boy. The child was light, terrifyingly light, his small body burning with fever against Silas's chest. His shack was barely a shack. It was more of a suggestion of a structure, cobbled together from scavenged timber and hope. The roof leaked in 3 places, and the wind whistled through the gaps in the walls. But it was dry, and a small smoky fire smoldered in the hearth. He settled them on his own cot, the only piece of furniture besides the wobbly stool and a crate he used as a table. The orc sank onto the straw mattress, her face a mask of exhaustion. She immediately pulled her son close, murmuring to him in her deep, rumbling tongue. Silas went to work. He stirred the embers of the fire, adding the few precious pieces of dry wood he had saved. He filled his only pot with water from the rain barrel and set it to boil. He tore a strip from one of his 2 shirts to use as a bandage. He approached her again, holding the warm, wet cloth. "Your leg," he said softly. She watched him, wary as a cornered wolf, but she allowed him to clean the wound. It was deep and ugly. He washed away the dirt and blood, his touch surprisingly gentle. He had been a medic for a short, brutal time. He'd learned how to tend to wounds without causing more pain than necessary. When he was done, he wrapped the leg tightly. Then he turned his attention to the boy. He crushed some willow bark, a poor man's fever reducer, into a cup and mixed it with a little warm water. The orc watched his every move, her hand resting on the boy's forehead. "What is his name?" Silas asked, holding out the cup. She hesitated for a long moment. "Korg," she said. Her voice was like gravel, unused to speaking his language. "Korg," Silas repeated. He offered the cup to her. "This will help the fever." She took it, sniffed it suspiciously, then gently coaxed her son to drink. Most of it dribbled down the boy's chin, but he swallowed a little. That night, they shared a meal. Silas boiled the roots he had almost left behind, creating a thin, tasteless broth. He gave the largest portion to them, taking only a few sips for himself. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Korg's labored breathing. In the flickering light, Silas could see the hard lines of the orc's face soften slightly. He saw the way she broke her root into tiny pieces for Korg, the way she brushed the hair from his fevered brow. She was a warrior. The scars that crisscrossed her arms and face told that story. But here, in his miserable hut, she was just a mother. And he, the outcast human, the veteran who had failed to save so many, was just a man trying to help. They were two broken people from different worlds, huddled together around a dying fire, sharing a meal that wasn't enough. She looked at him across the small space, her amber eyes catching the firelight. "Why?" she asked, the single word a monumental effort. Silas looked at the boy, then back at her. He didn't have a grand answer. He just shrugged. "You needed help." It was as simple and as complicated as that. He was an outcast. She was an outcast. In the eyes of the world, he was a debtor and a failure. She was a monster. But here, in the dim, smoky light of his home, they were just two souls adrift in a storm, clinging to the same piece of wreckage. He lay down on the cold floor near the fire, giving them the bed. He pulled his thin cloak around him. As he drifted off to sleep, he heard her shift. He expected a blow, a knife in the dark. Instead, he felt something land softly beside him. It was her cloak, a thick, heavy thing of hide and fur. It smelled of pine and snow and a world he had never known. He pulled it over himself. It was warm. For the first time in a long time, Silas didn't feel the damp chill of poverty in his bones. He felt something else, a fragile, tentative warmth, the beginning of a bond. If you believe that kindness matters more than species, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about unlikely heroes. Now, back to Silas's decision, because things were about to get dangerous. The days that followed were a strange, silent ballet of coexistence. The shack, already too small for one person, felt impossibly crowded with two more, especially when one of them was a head taller than Silas and twice as broad. He was constantly bumping into her, a solid wall of muscle and leather. She moved with a warrior's economy, but the confined space was not her element. She was a creature of open skies and windswept plains, caged in a box of rotting wood. Her name, he learned, was Gaza. She offered it one morning as he was changing the dressing on her leg. The wound was healing, but slowly. Infection was a constant threat. "Gaza," she had grunted, gesturing to herself. "Silas," he replied. Words were scarce between them. They communicated mostly through gestures and necessity. When the water barrel was low, she would tap it. When the woodpile dwindled, she would point toward the door. Korg remained their central, unspoken focus. His fever waxed and waned, a terrifying tide. In his moments of delirium, he would cry out for his mother in the harsh, guttural tongue of their people, and Gaza would be there, a monolith of maternal comfort, crooning soft songs that sounded like the whisper of wind through mountain passes. Silas did what he could. He foraged relentlessly, pushing deeper into the direwood than he ever had before, searching for the herbs his commander in the Army's medical corps had taught him to identify. He found lungwort for the boy's cough and more willow bark for the fever. He set snares, catching 2 scrawny rabbits that they made into a stew that lasted for 3 days. It was the most meat any of them had eaten in weeks. Gaza, for her part, refused to be idle. Her leg was still too weak for her to hunt or stand for long, but she found ways to contribute. One morning, Silas awoke to the sound of rhythmic thumping. He found Gaza sitting by the hearth, using a rock to hammer the wobbly leg of his stool back into its socket. It never wobbled again. Another day, a storm rolled in, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. A section of the roof, already weak, began to groan ominously. Silas looked up in despair, expecting it to collapse at any moment. Gaza, without a word, limped over. She braced her powerful shoulders against the main support beam, taking the strain, her muscles trembling with effort. She held it there for hours, a living pillar, while the storm raged outside. When it passed, the beam was still in place. Her face was slick with sweat, but her expression was one of grim satisfaction. She knew things about the world that he didn't. While he foraged for his familiar herbs, she would point out other plants, a gnarled root he'd always ignored, which, when boiled, made a thick, nutrient-rich paste, a type of moss that, when dried, proved to be an excellent insulator. He stuffed it into the cracks in the walls, and for the first time, the shack held a little of its warmth against the night. A strange domesticity settled over them. It was a life of hardship, a constant struggle against hunger and cold, but it was a shared struggle. In the evenings, Silas would sometimes light a precious tallow candle and sit by the fire, polishing his rusty key. It was a nervous habit, a connection to a past he couldn't reclaim. Gaza would watch him, her amber eyes unreadable. One night, Korg, in a rare moment of lucidity, pointed a small finger at the key. "Sinny?" he whispered, his voice a tiny thread of sound. Silas looked down at the key, then at the boy. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "It's a key," he said. He held it out for the boy to see. "It opens a door." Gaza watched the exchange, and a flicker of something, not quite a smile, but a softening of her hard features, passed across her face. The deepening bond was a fragile seed, pushing its way up through the hard-packed soil of their lives. But seeds are vulnerable, and the world outside the shack was not kind. The trouble started with Old Man Hemlock, Silas's nearest neighbor, who lived a quarter-mile down the muddy track. Hemlock was a man whose only joy was the misery of others. He noticed the extra smoke coming from Silas's chimney. He noticed Silas returning from the woods with more than just a few roots. His suspicion, a sour and curdled thing, began to fester. One afternoon, while Silas was out checking his snares, Hemlock decided to investigate. He crept up to the shack, peering through a grimy pane of glass in the single window. What he saw made his watery eyes go wide. He didn't see a woman nursing her sick child. He saw a monster. He saw a flash of green skin, the curve of a tusk, the hulking frame of an orc. The ancient, ingrained fear, the prejudice that was the town's lifeblood, surged through him. He ran. He ran all the way to the center of Greywater Crossing, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and malicious glee. He burst into the town's only tavern, the same one where Silas had nursed his bitter ale. "An orc!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Silas Thorne is harboring an orc. In his shack, a monster from the peaks." The word spread like wildfire on a dry plain. Monster. The word echoed in the tavern, bounced down the muddy streets, and whispered its way into every home. Fear, sharp and metallic, filled the air. Mothers pulled their children inside. Men grabbed pitchforks and axes, their faces grim. The fragile peace of Greywater Crossing shattered, and the word reached the ears of the one man Silas feared most. Lord Howell Critch was not a lord in the traditional sense. He held no noble title from the king. His lordship was one of finance. He was a moneylender, a man of ledgers and contracts. His family had systematically bought up the debt of the entire region until they owned everything, from the farms to the smithy to the very ground the town was built on. He was a man for whom everything had a price, and compassion was not on the ledger. He sat in his stone manor on the hill overlooking the town, a place of cold draughts and colder silences. He was a thin, precise man with ink-stained fingers and eyes like chips of flint. When his steward brought him the news of the orc, he did not react with fear. He reacted with calculation. He pulled a heavy ledger from his shelf. The book was bound in cracked leather and filled with names. He flipped through the pages until he found the one he was looking for. Thorne, Silas. The entry was long, a litany of debts inherited from his father, compounded by interest, fines, and fees. The man owed him a fortune he could never hope to repay. Critch had been waiting for a reason to foreclose on the shack and the small plot of land it sat on. The land was worthless, but it bordered the Direwood, and Critch had plans for logging. He smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. The town charter, which his grandfather had written, had a specific clause. Article 7, Section 4. Any citizen found to be harboring or aiding a creature of monstrous race shall forfeit all property and title, their debt to be considered paid in service to public safety. It was perfect. A legal, publicly sanctioned way to get what he wanted. He arrived at Silas's shack the next morning. He didn't come alone. He was flanked by two burly men who served as his personal guards and debt collectors. Their heavy boots squelched in the mud. Silas was outside, splitting a small log with a rusty axe. He froze when he saw them. The sight of Lord Critch made the familiar ache of hunger in his stomach twist into a knot of pure dread. "Thorn," Critch said, his voice as crisp and dry as old parchment. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "A pleasant morning." "My lord," Silas mumbled, lowering the axe. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. Critch's gaze swept over the pathetic shack, a look of utter disdain on his face. "Your account is, as ever, in arrears. Severely so. The interest compounds daily, you understand. A relentless arithmetic." I'll have the payment by the end of the week, my lord," Silas lied. It was the same lie he told every month. Critch gave a small, humorless laugh. "You will not. We both know this. You're a ship taking on water, Thorn. Sinking. The only question is how long you can bail before you go under." He took a step closer, his flinty eyes narrowing. "I've come because of a rumor, a disturbing one. They say you are not living alone. They say you've taken in a guest." Silas's blood ran cold. He could feel Garza's presence inside the shack, a silent, powerful weight. He knew she was listening. "I don't know what you mean, my lord," Silas said, his voice tight. "I live alone." Critch's smile widened. It was the smile of a predator that has its prey cornered. "Do you? Then you won't mind if my men have a look inside. For safety's sake, of course. One can't be too careful. There are monsters in these woods." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a naked blade held to his throat. Silas's mind raced. He could refuse. They would force their way in. They would find Garza and Korg. They would drag them out. What would happen then? A pitchfork. A rope. The town was a tinderbox, and Lord Critch was holding the match. From inside the shack there was a faint sound, a child's cough. Critch's eyes glinted with triumph. He had heard it. "Ah," he said softly, "it seems you have a secret. Secrets are expensive, Thorn, and you, my dear man, are very, very poor." He gestured to his men. "Check the hovel." Silas moved. He didn't know what he intended to do. He was half the size of the guards. But he planted his feet in the mud between them and his door. He raised the axe, not as a weapon, but as a barrier. "No," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "This is my home." Lord Critch looked at the axe, then at Silas's desperate face. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Brave and foolish, your home sits on my land. You live here by my grace, a grace which has just expired." He looked past Silas, at the townspeople who had begun to gather at a distance, drawn by the confrontation. "Citizens of Greywater Crossing, your neighbor has betrayed you. He harbors a beast under his roof. He puts your children, your families at risk." The crowd murmured, their fear stoked by Critch's words. They took a few steps forward, their faces a mixture of anger and terror. The door of the shack creaked open. Garza stood there. She filled the doorway, a silhouette of immense power against the dim light within. She held Korg in one arm, his small head resting on her shoulder. Her injured leg was braced, her jaw was set. Her amber eyes were fixed on Lord Critch, burning with an ancient, honorable fury. The crowd gasped. A woman screamed. The monster was real. Lord Critch's smile was a venomous slash across his face. He had won. He pointed a triumphant, ink-stained finger at Gaza, then at Silas. "You see," he cried to the crowd. "The proof. He has broken the charter. He has forfeited everything. This land is mine. The monster will be dealt with." The crisis had arrived, not as a whisper, but as a shout. The fragile piece of their tiny shared world had been torn apart. Silas stood between a furious orc, a terrified child, a greedy lord, and a mob of frightened townspeople. He was armed with nothing but a rusty axe and a desperate, impossible choice. The weak human standing against the world for the strong orc who was at her most vulnerable. And in his pocket, the rusty key felt as heavy as a stone, a useless relic of a past that could offer no escape from the present. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken violence. The villagers clutched their makeshift weapons, their fear a palpable thing, a scent on the wind like ozone before a lightning strike. Lord Critch's guards tensed, their hands on the hilts of their cudgels. Gaza stood in the doorway, a statue carved from granite and fury, her protective arm tightening around her son. It was a standoff, a tableau of prejudice, greed, and desperation. And in the middle of it all was Silas, weary, bone-tired Silas. He looked at the faces in the crowd. He saw Old Man Hemlock, his face alight with spite. He saw Martha, the baker's wife, who had sometimes given him a stale loaf of bread, her face now pale with fear. He saw young Tom, the blacksmith's apprentice, his knuckles white around the handle of a hammer. These were his people. They were not evil. They were scared. Scared of the stories they'd been told since birth. Scared of the unknown, and scared of Lord Critch. He lowered the axe. He let it drop into the mud with a soft thud. The gesture of surrender sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. Then he turned, not to Lord Critch, but to the townspeople. He held up his empty hands. "Wait," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't commanding. It was quiet. But in the tense silence, it carried. "Just wait." He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. This was it, the moment where he stayed down or he stood up. He had been keeping his head down his whole life. It hadn't worked. He was still drowning. "You all know me," he began, his voice gaining a little strength. "I'm Silas Thorne. My father was John Thorne. We've lived on this patch of mud for 3 generations. We fought in the King's Wars. We've paid our dues, and our debts, and our tithes. We were part of this town." He looked at Lord Critch, then back at the crowd. "Lord Critch tells you there is a monster in my home. He tells you to be afraid." He gestured behind him, toward Gaza. "You look at her and you see the stories. You see a monster. I see a mother. Her child is sick. He was dying. I found them in the woods, caught in a trap one of us set. What was I supposed to do? Leave them to die?" A man in the crowd shouted, "She's an orc! It's the law." "The law?" Silas's voice cracked with a sudden bitter anger. "Lord Critch's law? The law that keeps us all in debt? The law that allows him to own our homes, our lives? Is that the law you want to follow? A law of ledgers and coin, with no room for mercy?" He took a step toward them, his boots sinking into the mud. "I was a medic in the war. I've seen monsters. I've seen men, human men, do monstrous things for power, for greed. I've held dying boys in my arms, boys from our side and theirs. In the end, they all bleed the same color. They all cry for their mothers." His gaze fell on Gaza, on the small, feverish child in her arms. "This isn't about the law. This is about him." He pointed a trembling finger at Lord Critch. "He wants this land. He's using your fear to take it. He's using her," he gestured to Gaza, "as his excuse. He would see her and her child dead, just to own another worthless piece of dirt and cross a name off his ledger." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusty key. He held it up for them all to see, the metal glinting dully in the morning light. This was the key to my family's home. Before the debts. Before my father died. It's worthless. It opens no door. For years, I've carried it to remember what I lost. His voice grew thick with emotion. But today I see it differently. I have a roof over my head. It leaks and the wind blows through the walls. But it's a home. And she, he looked at Gaza, is trying to keep her home, her family, alive. I will not let another family be broken. Not for him. Not for his greed. He turned to face Lord Critch, his small frame seeming to possess a new, unshakable strength. You will not have this house. You will not harm them. The crowd was silent, stunned. They had never seen Silas like this. The quiet, downtrodden man was gone. In his place stood someone with an iron will. He had given them a new story. Not of monsters and fear, but of greed and compassion. They looked from Silas's earnest, desperate face to Lord Critch's cold, sneering one. And for the first time, some of them began to wonder who the real monster was. Can you believe they did that? If you're rooting for this strange family to survive, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Comment below, would you have opened your door? But hold on, because the system oppressor wasn't finished yet. And neither was the warlord hunting his prize. Lord Critch's face, which had been a mask of smug certainty, had curdled into a furious scowl. Silas's words had struck a nerve, not with him, but with the crowd. He could feel their certainty wavering. He could see the doubt in their eyes. This was unacceptable. Words, Critch spat, his voice sharp and cutting. Empty words from a bankrupt fool. He speaks of mercy, but he brings danger to your doorsteps. What will you do when this beast decides your children look like a good meal? Will his pretty speeches protect you then? The law is the law. It is what separates us from savages. He motioned to his guards. Seize him, and the creature, now. The two guards advanced, their cudgels raised. The crowd shuffled back, caught between their ingrained fear and Silas's impassioned plea. But before the guards could reach Silas, Gaza moved. She took a step forward, out of the doorway and into the full light of day. She gently passed the sleeping Korg into Silas's arms. Silas, surprised, stumbled back, but held the boy tight. Gaza straightened to her full, imposing height. She was a warrior born and bred. Even injured, even starved, she radiated an aura of immense power and dignity. She looked at Lord Critch, her amber eyes filled with a cold, clear contempt. You speak of savages, she said, her voice a low rumble that vibrated in the air. Each word in his language was carefully chosen, heavy with meaning. You, who hide behind paper and paid thugs. You who would kill a child for dirt. She reached into a pouch at her own belt, one that Silas hadn't noticed before. It was not a pouch for coin. It was old, made of worn leather and stitched with symbols he didn't recognize. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She was not revealing a weapon. She turned her hand over and into her palm fell a small handful of objects. They were not gold. They were not jewels. They were stones. Smooth, grey, and unremarkable at first glance. But as the sun hit them, they seemed to glow from within with a faint green light. They felt ancient, alive. You think I am a simple deserter, Gaza said, her voice resonating with an authority that silenced the entire crowd. You think I fled a battle. I did not. I fled corruption. A warlord who had forgotten honor. She held the stones up for all to see. These are the seed stones of the first mountain. The heart of my clan, the stones of Grakthar. They hold the memory of our ancestors, the promise of our future. Our warlord, Thrathrak, sought to trade them for human steel and black magic. He would have sold our soul. I took them to save my people, not to abandon them. The revelation hung in the air. She wasn't just a refugee. She was a guardian. a protector of something sacred. This changed the narrative completely. She was not a monster fleeing justice. She was a hero on a desperate quest. Lord Critch just sneered. Stones? You expect to pay your way out of this with stones and fairy tales? It changes nothing. You are a trespasser and a threat. But before he could give another order, a new sound cut through the tension. It was the sound of a horn, a deep, baleful note that seemed to come from the depths of the direwood itself. It was not a horn of the king's army. It was something older, more brutal. A wave of panic went through the crowd. They knew that sound from legends, the horn of an orcish war party. From the edge of the woods they emerged, 10 of them, no, 12. Orcs clad in black iron and cruel spikes. They moved with a disciplined, predatory grace. At their head was a massive figure, larger than even Gaza. He was covered in scars and trophies of bone. A jagged helmet fashioned from some great beast's skull obscured his face. In one hand, he carried a huge, double-bladed axe that dripped with something dark. This was Warlord Thrathrak's skull render. His eyes, burning like coals in the shadow of his helmet, scanned the scene. They passed over the terrified villagers, over the stunned Lord Critch, over Silas holding Korg. They landed on Gaza. Thief! Thrathrak's voice was a rasp of grinding rock and pure hatred. He pointed his massive axe at her. You are far from home, Gaza, and you have something of mine. The situation had escalated beyond anyone's control. This was no longer about a town charter and a patch of land. This was about warlords and sacred artifacts. The villagers, who had come with pitchforks to drive out one orc, were now faced with a dozen of the most terrifying warriors they had ever seen. Lord Critch's face went ashen. His guards looked at the war party, then at their cudgels, and took a step back. Their bravado evaporated in the face of real, overwhelming force. Thrathrak took a heavy step forward. Give me the stones, and I will grant you a quick death. Your child too. A mercy. Gaza's knuckles were white where she clutched the seed stones. She glanced at Silas, at Korg sleeping in his arms, her face a mask of tragic resolve. She was going to fight. She was going to die. But Silas, the non-combatant, the medic, the man who had only ever patched up the results of violence, saw something else. He saw tactics. He saw arrogance. Thrathrak's warriors were focused entirely on him and Gaza. They were ignoring the village. They were ignoring the terrain. They were warriors, not soldiers. An idea, born of desperation and forgotten training, sparked in his mind. It was insane. It was suicidal. It was the only chance they had. He looked at young Tom, the blacksmith's apprentice, who was frozen in fear. Tom, Silas hissed. The smithy, the flash powder. Do you have any? Tom stared at him, uncomprehending. What? Flash powder. For welding. Get it. And get your father's biggest hammers. Go now. Around the back. Don't let them see you. To his credit, the boy, jolted out of his paralysis by the command, nodded and slipped away into the crowd. Silas turned to Martha, the baker's wife. Martha, your ovens. Are they hot? Aye, Silas, since dawn. Get everyone you can to throw ash and soot out of the upper windows. On my signal, make a screen. He looked at Gaza. I have a plan. It's a bad one. Can you hold him? Just for a minute. Gaza looked from the advancing warlord to the small, determined human. She saw the frantic intelligence in his eyes. She had trusted him with her son's life. She could trust him with hers. She gave a sharp, single nod. For my son, she said. Then she dropped into a defensive stance, the sacred stones disappearing back into their pouch. She was weaponless, but she was a weapon herself. Thrathrak laughed, a horrid grating sound. You face me with empty hands. Your honor has made you a fool, he charged. The clash was brutal. Gaza, nimble despite her injury, dodged his first wild swing. The massive axe head buried itself in the mud where she had been standing. She used the opening to land a powerful blow to his side. It was like striking a stone wall. He grunted, annoyed more than hurt, and backhanded her, sending her staggering. As the two orcs engaged in their deadly dance, Silas moved. He shoved Korg into Martha's shocked arms. "Keep him safe," he yelled. Then he ran, not away from the fight, but toward the center of the town. "Now!" he screamed. On cue, from the upper windows of the bakery and the cottages, clouds of black soot and grey ash billowed out. The wind caught the fine powder, creating a thick, choking screen of darkness that enveloped Thrathrak's warriors. They coughed, blinded and confused, their disciplined formation breaking. At the same moment, from the direction of the smithy, came a deafening series of bangs. Tom and his father, using their largest sledgehammers, were slamming them against a massive sheet of steel. It sounded like thunder. It sounded like a counterattack. Then came the flash. Tom had thrown the pouch of flash powder into the smithy's forge. A brilliant, blinding white light erupted, followed by a concussive whoomph. Thrathrak's warriors, already blinded by ash, cried out in pain and confusion as the flash seared their vision. They had been expecting a fight with one injured orc and a mob of peasants. They were met with thunder, lightning, and magical darkness. They panicked, their discipline, born of arrogance, shattered completely. Thrathrak, momentarily distracted by the chaos erupting behind him, turned his head. It was the opening Gaza needed. She wasn't trying to kill him. Her honor demanded a different kind of victory. She lunged not at his throat but at his arm. She twisted, using his own weight and momentum against him. There was a sickening crack of bone. The massive warlord screamed, a sound of shock and agony. His axe fell from his nerveless fingers. Gaza kicked it away. He clutched his broken arm, his face contorted in pain and disbelief. She stood over him, breathing heavily, her fists clenched. She had not killed him. She had disarmed and dishonored him. In the eyes of their people, it was a fate worse than death. His warriors, their vision returning, saw it all. They saw their invincible leader, the skull-render, kneeling in the mud, disarmed by a lone female he had called a thief. They saw the villagers, no longer a terrified mob, but an organized, defiant force. Their morale broke. Shame was a more powerful weapon than any axe. One by one, they turned. They collected their fallen leader, hauling him to his feet. They did not look at Gaza. They did not look at the villagers. They looked at the ground, their faces masks of shame. Without a word, they retreated back into the direwood, dragging their broken warlord with them. Silence descended on the muddy street. It was broken only by the sound of Korg, awake now, crying for his mother. Gaza ran to him, ignoring her own pain. She took him from Martha's arms, holding him tight, murmuring to him. The townspeople stared, their pitchforks and hammers held loosely at their sides. They had just fought alongside an orc to defeat a greater evil. They had followed the orders of the town debtor. Everything they thought they knew had been turned upside down. Silas stood in the middle of it all, his chest heaving, his body trembling with adrenaline. He looked at Gaza and her son, safe. He looked at the retreating forms of the war party. He looked at Lord Critch, whose face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The debt had been paid, not in coin, but in courage. And the truth had been revealed, not in a ledger, but in the heart of a battle for a home. The weak human had saved the strong orc, who in turn had saved them all. A new community, forged in fire and ash, was about to be born. The aftermath of the battle was a strange, surreal quiet. The thick smoke of ash and soot slowly settled, coating everything in a layer of grey. The villagers stood frozen, looking at each other, at Silas, and at Gaza, who was now quietly rocking her son. The immediate threat was gone, but the world had been irrevocably altered. Lord Critch was the first to break the silence. His shock had quickly morphed back into his default state. Indignant rage. His plan was in ruins. His authority was shattered. "This changes nothing," he shrieked, his voice thin and reedy. "She is still a monster. You all violated the town charter. I'll have you all evicted. I'll have the King's Guard here. You'll all hang for treason." But his words held no power now. The fear he commanded was gone, burned away by the flash powder and the fury of the fight. It was young Tom who spoke first. He stepped forward, his blacksmith's hammer still in his hand. "You'll what, my lord?" he asked, his voice dripping with a newfound contempt. "You hid behind your guards while we fought. You would have let those brutes tear us apart. Silas here, he saved us." Martha, the baker's wife, nodded, her arms crossed over her chest. "He's right. And that orc, she fought for us too. She fought for her boy. I know a mother's heart when I see one." One by one, the villagers turned on Critch, the dam of their resentment, built over years of debt and quiet oppression, finally broke. They took a step toward him, then another. They were no longer a mob driven by fear, but a community united in anger. Critch's guards, seeing the tide turn so decisively, dropped their cudgels and backed away, melting into the crowd. They were townsfolk first, hired thugs second. Lord Critch was left alone, a small, petty man facing the collective wrath of the people he had squeezed for so long. He paled, his eyes darting around for an escape. He saw no allies, only hard, accusing stares. He turned and fled, stumbling through the mud as he scrambled back toward the cold comfort of his manor on the hill. No one chased him. They just watched him go, his power evaporating with every pathetic step. A new town council was formed by sunset. It consisted of Martha the baker, Tom's father the blacksmith, and 3 other respected elders. Their first official act was to declare all debts to Lord Howell Critch null and void, citing his cowardice and his attempt to endanger the town for personal gain. A rider was sent to the regional magistrate, not with a complaint against Silas, but with a formal accusation against Critch, backed by the sworn testimony of every adult in Greywater Crossing. The next day, a small group of villagers, led by Tom and his father, showed up at Silas's shack. Silas, seeing them approach, felt a moment of the old fear. But they weren't carrying pitchforks. They were carrying tools and lumber. "Your roof is a disgrace, Thorn," the blacksmith said, a gruff smile on his face. "We're here to fix it." And they did. The entire town seemed to participate. The men patched the roof and replaced the rotten wall planks. The women brought food, hot stew, fresh bread, things Silas hadn't tasted in years. Carter, her leg now properly bandaged by the town healer, directed the reinforcement of the support beams with an expert eye, her strength now a source of admiration instead of fear. They didn't just fix the shack, they rebuilt it. They made it larger, adding a second room for Gaza and Korg. It was no longer a hovel, it was a home, a real home, built not of scavenged scraps, but of shared effort and newfound respect. Korg's fever finally broke. The town healer, using a combination of her own knowledge and the strange moss-like herbs Gaza identified, brewed a potent tea that cleared his lungs. He woke up, weak but clear-eyed, and demanded food. Gaza wept, silent tears of relief that carved clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. A new kind of family formed within those walls. It was a strange and unlikely one. Silas, the quiet human veteran. Gaza, the honorable orc guardian. And Korg, the little boy who was now being spoiled with sweets from the baker and small wooden toys carved by the carpenter. The heartwood bond they formed was not one of magic, but of choice. They chose to be a family. Silas would read to Korg from a tattered book of children's stories he had kept. Gaza, in turn, would tell them stories of the stars, pointing out the Orsish constellations from the doorway of their new home. The Great Bear, the Hunter, and the Hearth, which represented family. One evening, Gaza presented Silas with a gift. It was a knife. Not a weapon of war, but a practical, beautifully crafted tool. The handle was carved from the horn of some mountain creature, and the blade was sharp and perfectly balanced. "For the protector of my son," she said. It was the highest honor she could bestow. Silas, in turn, gave her his most prized possession. He took the rusty key from his pocket. He had polished it until it shone. He pressed it into her large hand. "Every home needs a key," he said simply. Gaza closed her fingers around it. She understood. It wasn't about opening a physical door anymore. It was a symbol. He was sharing his past, his loss, and his hope for a new future with her. The following spring, when the ground had thawed, a ceremony was held in the center of the village. With the whole town watching, Gaza knelt. She took the seed stones of Grakthar from their pouch. They glowed with a soft green light in her palm. She didn't plant all of them. She chose one, the largest and most vibrant. She pressed it into the earth in the middle of the town square. "A gift," she announced to the assembled crowd. "Our past, to grow with your future. A bond of stone and soil. A promise that different does not mean enemy." A small sapling sprouted from that spot within a week. It grew with an unnatural speed, its leaves a vibrant, healthy green. The villagers tended to it with reverence. It became a symbol of their new reality, a living monument to the day they chose compassion over fear. The Heartwood Tree, they called it. Lord Critch was eventually removed from his manor, his land seized by the crown in light of his crimes. Thratharak Skullrender was never seen in the region again, his shame having driven him to the farthest, most desolate peaks. Life in Greywater Crossing was still hard. Winters were still cold, and harvests were not always bountiful. But the oppressive dampness of debt and fear was gone. It was replaced by something new, something hopeful. The sound of human children playing tag with a young orc boy around the Heartwood Tree became common. The sight of Silas and Gaza walking together to the market, a study in contrasts, became normal. One evening, years later, Silas sat on the porch of their sturdy, warm home. He watched Korg, now a strong, gangly youth, sparring with Tom's son, their laughter echoing in the twilight. Gaza sat beside him, sharpening the knife he had given her. The silence between them was no longer awkward or tense, but comfortable, filled with a deep and abiding understanding. He no longer felt like a ship taking on water. He felt anchored. He had found a port in the storm. He had found a family. He had found a home, not in a building, but in the brave new world they had all built together. And that is how a poor human veteran and an honorable orc guardian proved that family is a choice, not blood. If this story touched your heart, please smash that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about compassion overcoming fear. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even a rusty key can open a future. Thanks for watching.